Hey folks, this is Professor A. LeFay with a lecture on children's literature and speculative fiction. Genre definition and distinctions are an important um, part of understanding a larger genre like children's literature. So today we're going to talk specifically about children's literature and the genres of speculative fiction. In general, writing that speculates or imagines about a reality that does not exist and explores how the elements of that reality will influence the members of the portrayed society is a specific umbrella term for a group of genres. Usually, the reality created is metaphorically related to our own. The things that exist in the speculative world are used to symbolically comment on our own world. So, the things that exist with speculative fiction, there's a reality that is not real. Okay, it doesn't exist, but it's imagined in this piece of fiction. And that reality is usually a metaphor for our own reality. In other words, it's comparing the fictional world to the real world to say something about the real world. Now, the level of metaphor changes based on specificity. Okay? So, for instance, um, the comparison between the two worlds could be metaphorical, which means the comparison is very loose and generalized. So, The Giver by Lois Lowry is a metaphor of what happens when we use too much technology in our society, specifically genetic technology, and we don't retain the memories of the past. That is an example of science fiction with a subgenre of dystopia, and it's making a comment about our society because the main character is someone who has the ability to see color unlike the rest of the people in the world he lives in. And he's able to recognize that when a child is removed from the system, it is because they are genetically dissimilar to the rest of that society and are being removed, as in killed. And that is wrong. So he refuses to play along with this approach to society, kidnaps the child or rescues the child, and flees their society. Here we see an example of a metaphorical relationship. The main character in that story does not represent any real world human, so it's metaphorical. Allegory, on the other hand, is a text with a direct correspondence between the fantastic world or the this would be a speculative world, not fantastic. Between the speculative world or the fabulistic world and reality. There are fantastic or anthropomorphic characters, human, alien, or scientifically enhanced, or anthropomorphic monstrous, fant- fantastic or anthropomorphic characters who are presented in the story to suggest that they have a one-on-one correspondence to people in our world. Fabulistic means that the use of anthropomorphic animals is a setup for a fable. But they have a real world correspondence to actual people. that the characters represent. When the novel is very specific in the character, people, and historical event correspondence, it can also be called a roman à clef, which means novel with a key. So, for instance, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the series by C.S. Lewis, is about kids who discover a wardrobe that is magical and leads to another world. And they meet Aslan, which is a lion who metaphorically represents Christ. And because there's a one-on-one correspondence between Aslan and Christ, that becomes an allegory. Okay? But because there are additional characters who are not represented in reality, it remains an allegory. It's meant to talk about any person's Christian journey. On the other hand, there's a novel called Animal Farm by George Orwell, where every character in the book represents actual people who existed in history. So it takes place in a barnyard. And all of the characters are actually historical figures in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in the 19 teens. That is a roman à clef. Okay? Now, there are a ton of categories of speculative fiction, and it's important to know what those are. The main three categories are fantasy, horror, and science fiction. Now let's look at how those genres function. Fantasy novels create a correspondence between the world and our reality in a way that uses specific things, okay, as does horror and science fiction. So we'll go through them each independently. So fantasy is predominantly concerned with the idea of what makes someone heroic. What makes someone a hero of their world? We can see this in Harry Potter because it's all about how if he is strong enough to fight and defeat Voldemort. Okay? Historically, high fantasy, which is the most common type of fantasy, occurs in medieval times, a time period with horses and kings and queens. So the social setting is feudal. Okay? We have kingdoms, things of that nature. This feudal setting means that we have knights and kings and serfs. This is a part of European history called feudalism. There's also almost always an incorporation of magic and magical creatures, which we'll come across next. Geographically, it is usually a Neo-Europe, even though the worlds are often metaphorical and not literal. They mimic Europe in their topography, what they look like, and how people interact with them. For instance, when was the last time you saw a fantasy novel set in, say, a desert? There aren't too many of them. Or set in a world that replicates a rainforest, or a region that replicates South America, or the Middle East, or Africa. It doesn't happen very often, and that is why there is a growing critique of fantasy to say that it is not culturally inclusive enough and should include metaphorical comparisons of other parts of the world. In fact, Rick Riordan has started an imprint at a big publisher with the intention of doing just that. Okay? Oftentimes, the populations of these worlds are um, human and European, and also, um, sorry, my chart's not lining up exactly at the moment. Um, there we go. Mythological creatures drawn from Europe. Unicorns, dragons, dwarves, elves. Those are all European definitions of mythological creatures. We do not see a lot of jinn, for instance, um, Dginn, which is a mythological creature from the Middle East, as a genie. Um, the Lord of the Rings would be an example of a fantasy novel. Okay, that's serious. Okay, so horror, on the other hand, the thematic focus of this is a fear of the unknown, or sin, or darker human impulse. One of the largest fears grappled with in horror is our fear of giving in to our darkest selves and dying, which is why there are so many monsters. And there's such a rift between the most brutal things we can do to each other and so much death in the stories themselves. Okay. Oftentimes, in horror, there is either a modern setting or we are set back in time in the 19th century, usually in a decrepit old house or a remote setting in a forest. Okay. There's often a monarchy or an aristocracy. And the people who are the victims of the monsters are the working class. There's also often an exploration of mythological creatures and the supernatural. Vampires, werewolves, Frankenstein monsters, chupacabra, um, demons, angels, and things of that nature. Oftentimes, we have a geographical or physical setting in, again, the Neo Europe or the US. There's villages or rural small places, forests, decaying mansions. We talked about the fact that the population is usually human with monsters. An example of this would be The Haunting of Annabel Cray, which is a British novel. There's a recent film called The Haunting of, The House with the Clock in Its Walls. That's horror. You also have The Ring, Scream, so many more. There is a growing emphasis of horror within contemporary settings. And one of the explanations for that is that human behavior is becoming more horrific, more like the monsters of old. And as a result, we're seeing more horror set in contemporary times. Next, we have science fiction. Science fiction is about the effect of technology on society. This is looking at different elements of the effect of technology. So, like, what role does genetic technology play? What role does space travel play? What role do robotics play? I, Robot, an older film with Will Smith, looks at what effect it has when robots gain the technology or the technological development to develop sentience or the ability to think for themselves. What can happen in that instance? Oftentimes, science fiction is set in the future. Interestingly enough, one of the most famous examples of a horror novel is Frankenstein. And in many ways, Frankenstein is actually more of a science fiction novel at the time it was created because it was really about what would happen to the nature of the human soul if we developed the technology to bring someone back from the dead. And we didn't really have that ability in the 19th century. but we do in the 20th and 21st century because of our ability to restart the heart. Um, but in the time period that Mary Wollstonecraft created that story, um, I'm sorry, Mary Shelley. Mary Wollstonecraft is actually Mary Shelley's mother. Sorry. When Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, it wasn't actually possible to do that. And so it was actually science fiction. And what created that interest was the death of her own child. So it becomes horror by the shift in technology. But back to science fiction, it is the effect of technology on society is usually set in the future. The social setting is often militaristic and technology based. Um, Star Wars and Star Trek and the Avengers movies are all examples of science fiction. Um, and notice that each one of them looks at militaristic technology, that the relationship amongst the Avengers is very militaristic in nature. Oftentimes, the geographic settings of these stories are space, the United States, and cities. Ironically, somehow all of the Avengers are English speaking, for instance, um, and European or from the US. Why we don't have any. I mean, Black Panther is a very noticeable exception to this. I'm wondering where the superheroes are from Australia and Latin America myself. I'd love to meet them. The population is frequently humans, aliens, androids, and cyborgs, unless you're in the MCU universe, in which case we like to also borrow from mythology. Ender's Game is one of the most famous early examples of science fiction for children. The fantasy description above that we talked about earlier is high fantasy. It is often Euro and male centric, which has changed over time. There is a widespread call for multicultural fantasy that is based on other parts of the world and focuses on characters who are often underrepresented. A failed example of this is Rick Riordan's Lost Heroes. Wonderfully, Rick Riordan realized the mistakes he made by being too Eurocentric and by using very overly simplified portrayals of cultures outside of those traditions. He tried to correct this by creating his own imprint to champion people of color and previously marginalized groups who write fantasy. Now, every genre of speculative fiction has expanded to include subgenres. So, for instance, fantasy now has something called urban fantasy, which looks at the elements of hero quest and magical helpers in an urban setting. Um, Holly Black has an example of that when there's a uh, battle amongst the fairies in uh, a urban setting. Um, and another example of that would be the Spiderwick Chronicles. Toy fantasy, Toy Story being an obvious example. Historical fantasy is when you have a historical novel that combines fantastic elements. So we have uh, Fantastic Beasts is a historical fantasy. Because all of the stories take place in the 20th century and use magic. Reality based fantasy is an example. Harry Potter is one as well, because it's intended to be our contemporary world, but um, it uses fantastic elements. Animal fantasy, an example of that would be Charlotte's Web. Science fiction also has the dystopian element. Utopia is an element that is attempting to portray um, how the world should really function. Um, it is a term that translates literally as no place. Um, it was written by a man named Sir Thomas More. He's actually the guy who refused to give Henry VIII his annulment and was therefore killed. But his allegorical novel from that era was called Utopia, and most people acknowledge that his idea of a utopia would really lead to a dystopia, a world that is meant to be fantastic but would really lead to a horrible existence. Examples of dystopia are the Hunger Games, or Road Warrior, or The City of Ember, The Giver. These are all dystopic. One of the emerging fusion genres is steampunk. One of the interesting things about steampunk is it is actually a combination of every known form of speculative fiction. Its basic premise is that it looks at the advancement of technology, specifically steam technology, and asks the question, what would change if the forward progression of a particular form of steam technology would have advanced in a different way than expected? For instance, automatons. These are robots that are animated using steam. Most automatons of the 19th century were actually parlor tricks. They were supposed to be powered by steam, but they frequently were not because people couldn't figure out how to do it, how to create an engine in such a small space. So there were frequently people in suits rather than automatons. So steampunk asked the question, what if we had actually figured out how to do steam? Humanoid-like figures, which is what an automaton is. For instance, another thing that they have discovered is that, speaking of Mary Shelley, one of Mary Shelley's friends was Lord Byron. Lord Byron had a daughter named Ada Lovelace, and Ada Lovelace actually developed the technology that could have led to the establishment of the first computer. But because she was a woman and lacked financial backing, she was never able to bring her ideas to experimental fruition. Imagine where the world would be had Ada Lovelace succeeded at the turn of the 19th century. In any case, the Infernal Devices series by Clare is an example of steampunk. It's interesting because it looks at the effect of technology, which is science fiction, but it's in a historical setting versus a contemporary setting. It incorporates magic, which is fantasy, and it incorporates supernatural monsters, which is horror. So it just combines them all in a big old soup. Okay? Now let's talk about a genre that kind of defies classification because of issues of cultural appropriation. Magical realism is kind of a sticky wicket because it is actually not speculative fiction at all. It is realism. It is realism that incorporates elements that outsiders see as magic, but insiders see as reality. So, Supernatural is a television series that fits under the category of contemporary or realistic horror. Okay? It suggests that the Winchesters live in our world and our world is filled with monsters. Okay? And that is an element of horror because the people who make that show do not actually believe these monsters exist. But if there was a culture that believed, for instance, that ghosts exist and ghosts are totally real, then a story that portrays the existence of ghosts would be an example of magical realism. Because the person who created it believed ghosts are real. Okay? So it's not a horror story because the person who wrote it believes in this reality. There is a short story called The Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, which is about a couple who find an angel who is decrepit and dying and falling apart. And people come from all over and pay to see this angel. And the couple collect money to let people see this angel. And the angel becomes more and more decrepit and sick. And what you discover is that the angel is actually a metaphor for the idea of how. Sorry about that. How our reality cannot accept the supernatural needs of an angel. And when these people realize that what they're doing is spiritually wrong, the angel starts to recover. So the person who wrote this, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, believes in the existence of angels. So to him, the world portrayed in the very old man with enormous wings is realism. It's not magic, it's reality. So, for instance, if we looked at someone who could see the future, not because of technology or the introduction of magic, but because of the role of the Holy Spirit, a gift of the Spirit, detailed in the Bible, then that's not fantasy, that's not magic, that is realism. Okay? Let me know if you're having difficulty understanding the difference between magic realism and fantasy. But the elements of magic realism are that it has an unreliable narrator. The narrator often presents more than one view of reality, often says things that aren't true, leads us to question whether or not what the narrator is telling us is real or not real. There's an effort. Number two, there's an effort to portray reality in a culturally specific way. For anyone who travels abroad, they will quickly discover that the way time and manners are dealt with is very different. So, how people in Asia view wearing shoes inside someone's house, for instance. How in Latin America, when someone says, let's meet up at 2 o'clock and can show up at 3 o'clock and not see a problem with that. Our concept of time is culturally determined. So the portrayal of time in fiction is also culturally determined. Hence, number three, the fluid view of time. Number four, there's an incorporation of cultural elements that outsiders would view as magical, but insiders view as realism. Oftentimes, magic realism is defined as a component of fantasy. It's not fantasy, people. It is reality, as seen by people who see things that are supernatural in a way that is different than people from another culture. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So now that we've looked at all of this, what genre is the Book of Boy? Because we have looked at historical fiction and many different forms of speculative fiction. So where does the Book of Boy Fall. Okay. Thank you very much for listening to this lecture.